Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast.
The podcast that hopes to bring a national discussion on the differing intersections of the fight to end gun violence. This is your host, Addison Moore.
And Elijah Nichols.
From DC.
Welcome to Root Causes.
Today, we will be discussing and highlighting two amazing women in the gun violence prevention movement through a series of questions and answers. Our first guest, Kathryn Fleisher, uses she, her pronouns and is the executive director of Not My Generation. And our second guest, Madison Green, uses she, her pronouns and is the diversity and inclusion co-coordinator for Maryland's statewide chapter of March for Our Lives.
To get the ball rolling on this topic of gender, what do you most closely identify with? And how has your gender identity shaped the work you do in the spaces you've worked in?
So I identify as a woman, and this has shaped my worldview and my early understanding of inequality and injustice in probably more ways than I can acknowledge and put into words. I think even from a very young age, I couldn't necessarily name injustice, but I could see it and I could feel it. And I think those who identify as women probably have experienced that too, that we kind of operate in the world in a different way. And it forces you to kind of understand power structures differently. It forces you to think more about self-defense. It forces you to think about our relations with other people and how we communicate. And I think that that's really related to a concept that's heavily tied into what gender even means. And that's the term embodiment. And it really stems from this idea that there was a shift in the 20th century from this idea of rationality being the holy grail of like relational humanity. And that came from like old white philosophers, Locke, Mills, all that good stuff. And in the 20th century, that shift started happening where we realized rationality, quote unquote, and being disconnected and being able to look at everything from above was really a privileged stance to have on how the world works and how human beings communicate and work with one another. And so this idea of embodiment, of being a physical person in a physical space where you have a position-specific stance through which you view the world and interact with others, is something that came from women and people of color finally adding to philosophical and political works. And so I think about embodiment and our position in the world and how that impacts how we view things quite a lot.
Personally, I identify as a cisgender woman, and I would honestly say that gender really has shaped pretty much every aspect of my experience in the gun violence prevention movement because my appearance is very feminine. So when people see me, they automatically assume that I am a woman. That really affects how people interact with me and the type of experiences that I have. So especially when I'm protesting or if I'm working in the communities, there are certain calculations that I have to make as a woman myself because there are things I need to account for, especially with personal safety. You know, when we're talking about gun violence prevention, we're talking about a really highly contentious subject where a lot of people disagree with the subject of gun control or gun restriction. And so as a woman, I found that there's a lot more aggression directed towards me, especially because I'm in a position of leadership than there is to my male counterparts. So that's something that I really have to take into account in the work that I do. I just think it shapes how I look at the problems that we encounter in the gun violence prevention movement because I have been in positions where I feel like I'm not being heard. So to have that experience, it's made me a lot more receptive to the experience of other women and femme identifying people who are experiencing the same issues as me, that they need to have their voices heard. And I feel like it's my responsibility in this position to make sure that their voices are heard, where I feel like a lot of people don't carry that same responsibility.
What are ways in which non-femme or non-women identifying individuals can support women and femme identifying individuals in the gun violence prevention movement as a whole?
I think this is a great question. I think a really key piece that was brought to me a couple years ago and that has really stuck since I first heard it was the idea of moving away from quote unquote women's issues, instead actually defining what we're working on. So if you mean domestic violence by women's issues, then say domestic violence. If you mean reproductive justice, say reproductive justice. If you mean sexual violence, say sexual violence. Not only does it help clarify what we're actually talking about, it also helps to recognize the broader implications of these issues, because the reality is things like domestic violence, reproductive justice, sexual violence, etc., aren't only experienced by women. They're things that are experienced by men. They're things that are experienced by non-binary folks. They're things that are experienced by all of us and that impact everyone. So I think relegating them to being quote unquote women's issues tends to put them in a small box that means, only women or women's organizations work on them. and then they get kind of ignored or trampled on. And I think it's really important to take it out of that box and think of it as another complicating factor in our very complicated world, the same way that we think of, race and class and whatnot. I also think moving away from language that is reductionary, so not using language that reduces women to being someone or something in relation to a man, is really important. We see this a lot in more the activist than the organizing space, but you see, at rallies or marches, signs that say something about being someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's sister. And those things can be true. Like, I am someone's daughter, I am someone's sister, but I'm also me. And I'm a person, and my rights matter, independent of how a man who is related to me feels about my rights. I think it's reductionist and non-inclusive and frankly kind of rude. So I think, we move into all people matter and their autonomy matters and their agency matters, then we kind of move away from that. The final thing I wanted to talk about is also encouraging people to think through like the additional implications of certain policies or programs on women or other gender minorities. This is really important as a general concept in the gun violence prevention space and also just in the organizing space generally, that from our position-specific stance in the world, our embodied stance, we know that, we have privilege in some areas, we have knowledge in some areas, but then in other areas we don't. And so it's important to recognize our blind spots. And there's a long history of women, and particularly women of color and trans women and disabled women, being excluded from research that leads to the policies and programs that we advocate for. I don't have a GVP specific example off the top of my head, but a good example is in the health research space. We know that for many, many, many years, medications were researched on male bodies only. And we found out that women have been taking the wrong types of medications, the wrong amount of medications, et cetera, because we used men's bodies as the go-to for that research. And so to avoid doing that in other spaces, like in the gun violence prevention movement, we need to ensure that when we're studying communities, when we're looking at the implications of policy, that we're considering how that might impact women or other gender minorities specifically so that we can avoid any issues there.
So I think that on this subject particularly, I share a pretty common belief with other activists where if you're silent, then you're part of the problem. So a lot of times when you see something, you need to say something. A huge part of the problem with representing women and femme-identifying people is visibility, right? We can't even begin to address a problem if nobody's going to talk about it, right? We need to have that conversation. We need to have people who are willing to speak up. So it's really important for other women and femme-identifying individuals to just speak up when they see acts of injustice against other people.
How do you feel and how do you know that gun violence impacts women in a way that it may not impact other individuals with differing genders?
You ask any woman or gender minority individual in your life this question, they can tell you that they live under constant fear of violence. And maybe sometimes it is less pronounced, maybe sometimes they're not thinking about it as much. But the reality is that we are very, very aware of safety, of personal autonomy, and whatnot, because it feels like it's constantly under attack and under threat. And we're constantly turning on the news or social media to see someone else who's been abused or murdered or her rights taken away or their rights taken away. It just feels endless. I think that this is especially true for trans women, Black women, disabled women, etc. And I think it's really important, first of all, to acknowledge and validate that fear. I think that sometimes because it's so common, we sweep it under the rug and just excuse it as a part of life or part of the American culture or something that's unavoidable. And the truth is that that doesn't have to be the case. It's the way that we approach it and the way that we excuse it that allows that cycle to perpetuate. One specific example of gendered violence that really stuck with me and I think hit home for a lot of women was the shooting in November of 2018 at the hot yoga studio in Tallahassee, where the shooter was targeting women because he felt rejected by them and he felt like they owed him something. And I think that was really scary because a lot of us walk around with that fear. And maybe we don't, think someone with a gun is going to come into our yoga studio, but, we fear retribution. And the availability and prevalence of firearms only exacerbates that fear. And that is so dangerous. And we're not doing anything to curb those effects, to ensure that folks who are dangerous don't have firearms. We're doing nothing to ensure that the women who would be the targets are protected. I mean, for the shooting in Tallahassee, the FBI knew that the shooter had a history of misogynistic posting online. He was a part of groups that talked down about women, and they knew. And they also knew that he had firearms, and nothing was done, and people lost their lives because of it. And that's the reality of gendered violence. We have to disrupt that cycle of allowing it to happen. I also think when we talk about gun violence against women and gender minorities, it's also important that we put the onus on changing the reality on the perpetrators and not the victims. I think we hear this trope a lot when we're talking about sexual violence and, ensuring that we're telling men and boys that they should respect women instead of telling women to wear different clothes. But it's the same thing with gun violence. It's not about why did you not leave the abusive household, or why did you not just say yes to a date with that person? It's why did anyone feel entitled to someone else in the first place? Why did anyone feel that they had any right to harm someone because they didn't get what they want? Finally, just to address domestic violence or intimate partner violence specifically, because that really impacts women. I think when we talk about women and gun violence, that's what most of our minds go to. I think it's really, really important that we address domestic violence and intimate partner violence as a holistic issue, that we look at it in the different ways that it impacts different communities and how to get people out of those situations. And I think it benefits everyone in society if we're able to kind of take domestic violence out of the box that we put it in and look at it as a real part of the American fabric, unfortunately, because until we do that, I don't think we're actually going to make significant changes on ending domestic violence.
I think gun violence impacts women and femme-identifying individuals specifically in the type of violence as well as how people respond to their experiences with violence. Some gun violence issues that are primarily faced by women and femme-identifying individuals are domestic violence and hate crimes, and those are really further exacerbated by gun violence itself, right? And not only that, but the type of gun violence that is primarily faced by women is the type of gun violence that you really don't talk about, and that it doesn't get attention and it doesn't get resources. So take domestic violence, for example. Gun violence and domestic violence are really intertwined. It's 5 times as likely to be killed in cases of domestic violence with a gun. Domestic violence is primarily experienced by women. In cases of domestic violence, don't really get media attention or mainstream conversation, so it's not really addressed. And when we talk about resource allocation, we don't really allocate enough resources to communities where they're experiencing high rates of domestic violence. So that means when we have progress on issues of gun violence, we don't really get that same progress in issues that are primarily faced by women, such as domestic violence. So a lot of women find themselves in cycles of abuse, because if you experience violence and nobody's helping you and nobody's reaching out to you, then that cycle is going to continue. And I found that that's a problem that, especially in a lot of communities that I've worked with, they don't get the help that they need because the issues that they go through as women regarding gun violence aren't really addressed.
Do you believe the way we talk about gendered violence within the gun violence prevention movement is inclusive of the experiences of both women and femme-identifying survivors? You've touched on this a little bit in different portions, but I really want to fully grasp your idea on inclusion, specifically in the context of gender within spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really have 2 answers to that. And the first is that it's dependent, right? I think it depends on 1, who you ask, and 2, what part of the gun violence prevention movement or the wider social justice movement you're a part of. I think different parts of the movement are more or less progressive or have more or less, inclusive practices. So I think obviously it depends on that. And then the piece about depending on who you ask, for me personally, as a straight white woman, it feels inclusive to me, but I'm also not the person to ask. So I think that that's a tough question because until the right people are at the table and in leadership, in the halls of power, in nonprofits, even in like familial spaces, we're not going to get to the point where that language is fully inclusive and able to accomplish what we mean for it to accomplish. And then the second part of my answer is that identifying survivors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence is really hard. And it's not just hard for people who are quote unquote on the outside, it's hard for people who are on the inside too, to even determine if they identify as a survivor or not. and then how to navigate that situation, whether you're an ally, whether you're directly impacted, what you need and how to take care of your mental and emotional health while doing this work, as opposed to how you're using your story. There's just a lot at play. And I think that more women and gender minority folks have experienced sexual or domestic violence and are willing to admit. And so I think that that really begs the question of how kind and patient and cautious we're being with the people in our communities, because I think we have an obligation to validate and provide support and resources to folks, even if they don't necessarily know if they're the ones who are going to need those resources or not. And then another piece of that I wanted to mention, I think is important, is the threat of violence is also trauma. I think sometimes we say, if something was carried out and someone had something directly perpetrated against them, then they're a survivor, then they've experienced trauma, then they're in that camp. And I think that kind of leaves behind a lot of people who kind of live in the shadow of abuse or assault and maybe didn't have anything physically happen to them, but that they really, lived in fear and still carry the signs of trauma that folks who did experience that may carry. And that hits home for me. And I don't often talk about this, and it's hard to articulate, but I don't see myself as a victim of gendered violence, of sexual violence, but I am. And when I talk about victims and survivors, I'm not thinking about myself. I'm thinking about kind of a nameless, faceless person. And I think that makes me disconnected sometimes from work in the intersection of gendered violence and gun violence. And I think that comes down a lot of the times to the language that we use and the types of, resources we have in place to be kind and patient and cautious. So I just want to take this space to say, whether you identify as a survivor or a victim or not, take the time to be patient with yourself and figure out what you need to know about yourself in order to be a good advocate for others.
I think it's about bringing women to the table, right? You can't have conversations about experiences if you don't have those people at the table. So a lot of times if I go into summits for gun violence, or if I'm sitting at the table and we're having a discussion about gun violence, I can't look around and see anybody that's been affected by domestic violence. I don't see any trans women. I don't see any femme identifying individuals. I don't see these people having their voices heard. When we want to talk about inclusivity, it's not just getting people to tell their stories, it's having them tell their stories themselves, because nobody can do it better than them. We need to include them in the conversation. We need to include them in these talks about policy, and these talks about what's best for their own community and for their own needs, right? We can't get anywhere if they're not even at the table. That's the first step.
So now to get more policy focused, we really want to know at Root Causes, at Not My Generation, individuals that are coming out of this podcast, what they believe the best policies are for their communities or their identity. So the question that I have for you, what kind of gun violence prevention policies do you believe to be the most pro-women, which sort of tackles the issues that we've talked about all through this episode?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I wanted to thank you for asking it in the way that you did. Going back to one of my previous answers, kind of takes intimate partner violence, domestic violence, etc., out of the box of quote unquote women's issues and brings it into the wider conversation on gun violence and protecting violence against different groups of people. So thank you for that. And I think that there are two categories that I want to mention. First, I think, is directly about gun policy, mostly in regards to background checks. There are two loopholes that are really problematic that need to be closed. The first is the boyfriend loophole, which essentially the issue with that is that if you are an abuser and you have lived with and been married to someone that you've abused, you can't purchase a firearm, i.e. you'll be flagged in your background check. But if you were a boyfriend, significant other with that person and didn't have the marriage piece and you abused them, you can still purchase a firearm without anything coming up on your background check. And that is really scary. The second piece is the Charleston loophole, which the issue with that is that if your background check doesn't clear in 3 days, like you don't get anything back, you can just go ahead and purchase a firearm anyway. And so closing the loophole would mean that you cannot purchase a firearm until your background check comes back. And that's also really, really important. So in terms of gun policy, closing the boyfriend loophole, closing the Charleston loophole, really important, and making sure that guns don't get into the hands of abusers in the first place. Second, And this one is a little bit bigger picture, but I think that there are a lot of proactive approaches that we can take to limiting future cases of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. The first is that there's a push underway to require gun dealers, to notify law enforcement when a noted abuser is attempting to purchase a firearm. So let's say that someone was an abuser, they went to a gun store, they wanted to buy a firearm, they ran the background check, and it came back that they couldn't buy it, and they were turned away without a firearm, that is still reported, because it likely means that that person should either be watched or flagged or something. And so it's a way to get out ahead of instances of potentially fatal domestic violence. And then second, just bigger picture, is we need to increase funding for programs and organizations that help remove those at risk from harmful environments, being able to kind of provide that direct support and get people out of the point where them and potentially their children or other loved ones are in direct danger is really, really, really important. And then also, as we talked about earlier, ensuring that we are thinking about the wider structures that allow this type of violence to be perpetuated, time in and time out, approaching things from a systemic, proactive approach, as well as some of the more direct gun policy related pieces, I think is what we're going to need to cut down on domestic violence and gendered violence in a significant manner.
In my experience, in my opinion, the best pro-women policies against gun violence are the ones that allocate money to grassroots, like on-the-ground networks of organizations. For example, there was a bill going through the Senate this last round. It was the National De-Escalation of Violence and Community Safety Act. And it was a bill that, among other things, allocated $10 million for tribal organizations. And I think sometimes, especially in the gun violence prevention movement, we get caught up a little bit on the idea that in order to solve gun violence, we need to restrict gun access. We need to take away guns. And I think that's part of it, right? So taking guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them is really important. But we lack a comprehensive solution when we fail to address, the root causes, right? So we have to address the underlying cause. We have to address the sexism and transphobia that fuel gun violence against women, right? It's not just taking away the guns. We need to address the things that are actually driving the gun violence.
Thank you both for taking the time to speak with us. We hope to have you both back soon. Before we have you both go, we wanted to ask if there was anything that you want to say to all the women or femme-identifying individuals that are listening right now.
So I actually want to offer a message to people who are not women and not femme-identifying first, and that is to say, asking questions is always a good bet. I think people get scared about the gender conversation. I think people edge away from it because they're not sure what kind of terminology to use or scared of upsetting people. But if you come to someone with a genuine desire to learn more, to be a better ally, to better love and support them, no one is going to be upset with you for that. So if you give respect to someone and ask questions and try to understand them better and how you can help them better, you're going to receive respect in return. To women and femme-identifying folks, my advice to you would be, don't get boxed in. Be your full person in all of your beautiful, complicated, unique glory, because that is the position that you operate in the world. That's what you bring to the table. That's what you have to offer. And being a woman, being femme-identifying is part of who you are, but it doesn't have to define you. So be proud of it. Use it to your advantage. Use it to protect other women and femme-identifying folks. But be your own person too.
I think more than anything, I want to say I do hear you, and that there are plenty of people who do hear you, and that we're fighting really hard so that everyone will have to hear you, right? Because your struggles are valid, and your stories deserve to be heard. So please don't give up. When I was really going through it, like with gun violence and dealing with being targeted for being a woman, one of the things that was the hardest for me is that I felt like I was doing it alone, because at least in my community, there's kind of a stigma about talking about violence against women. If we don't talk about it, then maybe it'll go away, but that never actually happens. So I just want to say, even if you feel like you can't talk about it, that there are other people struggling out there with you. You're not alone, and there are people fighting to help you stop struggling.
Thank you for that uplifting message on this sort of heavier conversation at some points. Thank you for listening to episode 3 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast, where we discuss women in the gun violence prevention movement with Kathryn Fleisher and Madison Green. Please join us next Tuesday for an episode on Puerto Rico's fight against colonialism and state-sanctioned violence. In solidarity, Elijah Nichols,
Addison Moore,
Kathryn Fleisher,
and Madison Green.